All right, so our last set of notes, we're looking here at the Cold War. The superpowers face off. And understand that due to time constraints, we are not going to get through the whole Cold War. We're just looking here pretty much after World War II and some of the things that are really building up between the United States and the Soviet Union. So here we have in our first picture our original big three: Churchill, FDR, and Stalin. So that was at Yalta. So we know that our allies eventually become enemies because we ended the last set of notes where they became enemies. This slide here is just a repeat of how things were building up and what was discussed at Yalta. I'm not going to go through that again. So, looking here at our Cold War in a nutshell, great political cartoon. Here you have one side in all of their nuclear weapons, and the other side with all of their nuclear weapons. And we're going to see as you go through the Cold War and through the arms race, they're going to keep building more and more weapons, more and more bombs that can just destroy the other one multiple times over. And the other side does the same thing. So they have these big, powerful weapons that could destroy each other. But then if you look at the little sign, it says on no account to be used because the enemy might retaliate. And there it says the same thing. And so as we go through the Cold War, we're going to shoot bow and arrow. We're going to shoot arrows at each other. We're going to use bow and arrows to fight each other. The United States and the Soviet Union do not get in a head-to-head combat. They are going to use everyone else's problems to fight each other. So the Cold War doesn't happen where the US and the Soviet Union actually come head to head, although we had two cases where it almost happened. But we ended up pretty much dealing with everyone else's issues and saying, we will help your side if you join our cause, and the Soviet Union will do the same. So the United Nations, we talked about how the United Nations was created, UN international organization of 50 nations at the time of its creation. It's to maintain peace and be non-aggressive. However, there are troops, and every member sends troops if they're called upon. However, if let's say that I'm the United States and one of my allies has done something and the United Nations believes that it's time that they actually have to send troops to stop them, I can choose not to send troops against my ally. It is a choice whether or not to get involved in something like that. We've already talked about who the 5 permanent members are. And the UN still exists today, and it does provide humanitarian aid, and it does assist in conflicts around the world. And a lot of people wonder why it doesn't get involved more militarily instead of just standing by with humanitarian aid. But they do have to, walk that fine line of not infringing upon another nation's sovereignty. 2 areas that needed humanitarian aid and assistance by the UN would be in Libya and Syria back in 2012, and we still see that action by the UN today. The Security Council with Great Britain, China, France, US, and the Soviet Union, they are the 5 permanent, but members from other countries get rotated in and out of the Security Council, but the 5 members are always the 5 members. And if you notice, these are countries that weren't on the same page, and they are not always going to be on the same page. So unlike the League of Nations that actually excluded countries, we're actually willing to say, hey, we should probably figure out how we're going to do this together. Differing sides between the United States and the Soviet Union. They have different goals. The Soviet Union is totalitarian government-wise, and their economic system's communism. For us, we're looking at a democracy, we are a republic, and we have a capitalist economy. These are 2 sides that don't get along, yet we were allies during the war because we had a common enemy. Now, how are we going to work together? Yeah, we're not really going to work together. For the Soviet Union, they see Eastern Europe as a way to industrialize and provide for the Soviet Union. We see Eastern Europe as a way to gain access to raw materials and new markets, but to have that free market economy, that capitalism where things are going to flow, and we can benefit from it. For the Soviet Union, no, we're going to industrialize you and use you for the benefit of the Soviet Union. They want to control Eastern Europe and deny Western influence because they said democracy is not going to work well along their borders because it's going to try to influence their people to break away from their totalitarian and communist regime. For the United States, they want to rebuild European governments, get those markets, and create friendly relations and start to help Europe grow again after the war. And for the Soviet Union, they said Germany must always be divided in order to prevent a war from erupting. Now, when they had decided to carve up Germany into those four occupied zones, along with Berlin, the Soviet Union apparently was the only country who really thought that was going to be a permanent solution. The United States and Great Britain really saw it as temporary, where eventually they would start to merge those zones again and create a unified German state. This area here is going to be a huge problem because they are not on the same page and they did not define those terms when they had actually carved up Germany. Now, we know that at Potsdam, Churchill was no longer prime minister, and he is going to venture over to the United States as former British prime minister, and he's really going to bring this fear into the United States, into Truman, who has already clashed with Stalin at Potsdam. So Russians feared invasion from the West due to past attacks. And yeah, they've been attacked a couple of times. And they really wanted to create these satellite nations along their border between the East and the West. And Eastern Europe is where they wanted those satellite nations, nations that were more in tune with the Soviet Union, working with the Soviet Union, and had governments that were friendly toward the Soviet Union. And that's where he's going to bring in his salami politics. So when you look at his salami politics, it's like you get, salami, lunch meat, and you slice it, you carve it up. So, this whole idea of creating these satellite nations and this whole free elections, stage one, you supervise the organization of governments in Eastern Europe along, your border. Create this alliance. And then you start to slice off in stage two, one after the other, each of the parties. And then stage three, you have this communist core that's left over. So everyone gets removed except that communist group. Now, it's not communist people who come from those countries, let's say in Poland, in Hungary, in Czechoslovakia. No, it's trained communists that came from Moscow that Stalin's going to send over. So they're not even willing to work with the local communists in these countries. And anyone, and particularly in Poland, they went through and they said, okay, we'll have free elections. But when people showed up, they weren't on the registration to be able to vote. Sorry, you're not there. You're not a registered voter. Or people were thrown in jail. So election day comes, you're in jail, you can't vote. And then the ultimate thing that the Soviet Union likes to do, people die. They're dead. They can't vote. So he found a way to get around this whole free elections. We'll have free elections. We'll eliminate the people who would vote against us. Either throw them in jail, they're not listed as registered voters, or kill them. Elections happen, it's going to be a communist nation, and it will be communism under Stalin's control. Moscow trained communists, not local communists. So he states that communism and capitalism cannot coexist, so Eastern Europe needs to be under Soviet control. Churchill wants to point out here's a problem. He says that an iron curtain has descended upon Europe and that we are never going to see this freedom again. I'm going to slide to this map. So here we have the political cartoon with the Iron Curtain. An Iron Curtain did not actually fall. And I've had students in the past who say, wow, they really had an iron border. No. This is not the Berlin Wall. We'll talk about that a little later. This is just a metaphor that the East and the West have been split. It's like an Iron Curtain has descended. And former Prime Minister Winston Churchill actually went to Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri in March of 1946. And Harry S. Truman was there, and he was president of the United States. And really what Churchill is doing is egging Truman on. He starts his speech as this warning of this danger that's happening in Europe. A shadow has fallen upon the scene so lately lighted by the Allied victory. Nobody knows what Soviet Russia and its communist international organization intends to do in the immediate future, or what are the limits, if any, to the expansive tendencies of this nation. He talks about from the Stettin and the Baltic to the Trieste and the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind the line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe. Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, Sofia, all these famous cities and the populations around them lie in the Soviet sphere, and all are subject in one form or another, not only to Soviet influence, but to a very high and increasing measure of control from Moscow. He then goes on and says, I do not believe that Russia desires war. What they desire is the fruits of war and the indefinite expansion of their power and doctrines. Our difficulties and dangers will not be removed by closing our eyes to them. They will not be removed by mere waiting to see what happens, nor will they be relieved by a policy of appeasement. Oh, he brings in appeasement. Remember, we appeased Hitler at Munich, and Czechoslovakia got destroyed. So then he ends it. If the Western democracies stand together in strict adherence to the principles of the United Nations Charter, their influence for furthering these principles will be immense. If, however, they become divided or falter in their duty, then indeed, catastrophe, many, may overwhelm us all. He really pulled Truman, sucked him right in, because Churchill has no power. He is no longer prime minister. He has no country, government, military backing him. He is pulling on Truman to do his work. Go into Europe and stop the spread of communism, stop the expansion of the Soviet Union. So looking here at this map, we can see this is where the Iron Curtain, the line between the East and the West. These are countries that fall under communist control. Now, we have Yugoslavia down here. It is a communist nation. Tito is the leader of Yugoslavia. He is not going to take words or any kind of orders from the Soviet Union. It's a communist nation. He says, I didn't need your help to get the Nazis out. We are not taking orders. So it does remain as a communist nation, and not being a part of that Soviet bloc, that opens him up where if he needs assistance elsewhere, because we're going to issue a little thing called the Marshall Plan, then that can open him up to actually gaining some funds. But that Iron Curtain, we see this red line going down, and actually eventually we're going to have a little Albania fall in there too, is where we're going to see that split. And Churchill coming to the United States in March of 1946 is pulling on that ego of Truman and building on that hostility that started between Stalin and Truman back at Potsdam. So let's look how these foreign policies are really going to increase the tensions. Containment. That becomes our policy throughout the Cold War, that communism is not to spread. And one of the things that we actually use to come up with this policy is George Kennan's long telegram. And he was our diplomat, our U.S. diplomat to Moscow during this time. And in February of 1946, he actually sends a telegram. And he says that the USSR's view of the world was a traditional one of insecurity, and that the Soviets wanted to advance their Stalinistic ideology, not just Marxism, which, we go back to Karl Marx and the Communist Manifesto, but Stalin's version of it. And that the Soviet regime was cruel and repressive, and they justified this by perceiving nothing but evil in the outside world, that their view of this hostile outside environment would sustain their internal Stalinist system. So Kennan is the one who is actually bringing forth this idea that we need to contain. We need to make sure that the Soviet Union is not going to spread. Now, we have this letter, an article called the Mr. X article, and the Time magazine had actually issued it, and he posted this in July of 1947, and where we are being strongly encouraged to see it is clear that the United States cannot expect in a foreseeable future to enjoy political connection with the Soviet regime. It must continue to regard the Soviet Union as a rival, not a partner in the political arena. Now let's stop and think about this. We're looking here at 1947, 2 years after World War II has ended. We saw in World War II, the Soviet Union was devastated. They put everything they had to defeating the Germans. Could they really engage in another war? They were not in a position to do so, but there were people who were so anti-communist, who were so anti-Stalin, that was putting information out there to Truman to stop them. And they discovered later on that the information that Truman was given was false. The Soviet Union was not planning military action. They didn't have it in them at the time to have any military action. And they were also scared at that time because the United States had the atomic ability to drop bombs on them. We had that nuclear capability. They did not. Truman rejects communism, and we see this clearly in the Truman Doctrine. And this particular doctrine makes the United States the police of the world, where the Truman Doctrine with its issuance was to stop the spread of communism. So it would provide aid to any country that was under outside pressure or aggression, communism, and could not have governmental self-determination. We believed in this domino theory, that if one nation fell, and this really applies in Asia, if one country fell, then they all in that area will fall like a row of dominoes. So countries that want to stop the outside pressure, they do not want to fall to communism, we would come in with aid to assist them. Now, years later, we're going to continue with this policy, but we're going to replace communism with terrorism. So for anyone wondering, why does the United States get involved in a lot of countries around the world? We are continuing to be the police. We saw what happened at the end of World War I. We did not join the League of Nations. We did not get involved with things that was happening with the rise of Hitler and Nazi Germany, or what was going on in Italy and the fascists with Mussolini. We were isolationists. We removed ourselves. Yet we were the powerhouse at the end of World War I, and we did nothing. So we weren't going to run that chance again, and then we become the police for the rest of the world. The Marshall Plan. We offer aid to any, and I mean any, European nation. It just wasn't countries in the West. It was any European nation that wanted our military assistance. Now, Congress, excuse me, was not on board with really sending a $13 billion project to start bailing everyone out from World War II and helping with their countries to recover. And we set it up where this Marshall Plan, we would provide this military aid for any country, including the Soviet Union and the countries within their bloc that they were creating. But there's a catch. In order to receive any funds from the Marshall Plan from the United States, you have to open up your government books, and particularly your bank account. We have to look at all of your financial transactions. We knew that there was absolutely no way the Soviet Union was going to give us access to their records. That's why we put it in there. We didn't want the world to make it look like, oh, we're going to exclude Eastern Europe, we're going to exclude the Soviet Union and not offer them assistance to help with recovery. We did. We just put some stipulations in there that we knew they wouldn't accept. And our Congress wasn't really going to accept what was happening here with a $13 billion project. But then the Soviet Union makes a big mistake. And they send troops in to crush a little bit of a rebellion that was going on in Czechoslovakia. And we said, we're not going to let Czechoslovakia fall again. But they do. They do fall into communism. But the Soviet Union's actions is what actually passes this Marshall Plan through Congress, because then we see that, yes, communism has become aggressive and we are not going to allow it to spread. So we had mentioned that whole Berlin and Germany thing, all of those zones, and how they had set up the 4 occupied zones, and not only with the state of the country of Berlin, but then also, the country of Germany, but then also in Berlin, a city stuck right here in the Soviet sector. Like that wasn't going to be a problem. So what happens here? Remember I said that Soviet Union did not want to see the occupied zones join together. But Great Britain and the United States, and then eventually France, once they have their zone, believe that eventually, yes, we're going to unite our sectors and help Germany be a recovered nation. So the Great Britain, France, and the United States actually did join their sectors. And they saw this as a way to actually start to get the economy up and rolling again. And this infuriated Stalin. It infuriated the Soviet Union. Now, what they actually, when you look at this zone here, because this is the Soviet sector, they needed the Soviet permission for them to be able to communicate to their zones within Berlin. So with those zones, the US zone, the French zone, and the British zone, they needed, in order to get communication into Berlin to their individual sectors, because it's into 4 zones too, they had to have Russian permission to use the communication lines in order to do that. So when they united their zones to create pretty much West Germany, the Soviet Union said, we're done. You're blocked. So they blocked off that communication, and they blocked off the West Germany to their zones within Berlin, hoping to, kind of force their hand. So the Soviets keep West Berlin, the Berliners hostage to trying to get any kind of assistance, because they're supposed to take care of their zones. So the United States has to, they're figuring out, what the heck are we going to do? This is going on 3 years after the war. Are we actually going to fight over this? So instead, within 2 days of the Soviet Union blocking all the borders to Berlin, the United States, Great Britain, and France are now starting a rescue mission. 2 days. And 2 days after that blockade, we have Operation Vittles. We are going to provide our zones with supplies. And they had to figure out, all right, how are we going to organize this? What are we going to decide? Like, what are we going to send? How much? what's the quickest, easiest way to transport, and they decide all the food has to be dried. Dried milk, you get flour, stuff that you can just add water to and send it on in. And that's what they do. So they set up the airports within their zones, and eventually we'll get another airport within the French zone. But they are pretty much coordinating. And the guy who's really going to coordinate this, his name's General William Tunner. And he is going to coordinate hundreds of different planes in a rapid, relentless flow in and out of the zones and in and out of Berlin. They wanted to be able to get the planes to land in Berlin every minute, but what they actually get are planes landing in Berlin every 3 minutes. And what these planes are running into, they have bad weather, they have traffic jams, and they were dealing with actual Soviet fighter planes coming up to them with guns. And we're sending planes in with dry food to drop off for the people to unload and go and disperse and feed their families. And here we're running into Soviet fighter planes, but they're not shooting at each other. They're not shooting at our planes. They land where they need to in Berlin, they unload, and they head back to their sector to get more supplies. And it becomes this conveyor belt between Frankfurt and Berlin. And William Tunner and his staff, they do an amazing job at coordinating all of this and getting planes coming in every 3 minutes. And then we start to drop off toys and candies to the little kids. And for Stalin, that's like outrageous, capitalist, outrageous trick. And that's not even true. I mean, they start to drop off candy, and then when they're turning around, they start to drop it off to the kids in the Soviet sector too, because literally the only thing that's splitting these areas in Berlin is a fence, a barbed wire fence. So you can see on one side, the kids are getting toys and candy, and you guys would want the toys and candy too. And so they started to drop that off. This is going to continue for a while. And then finally, on May 12th, 1949, the blockade is lifted because pretty much it becomes a routine. I mean, things are flowing in, they build another airport, and it's not causing any problem. Although we did have members of Congress and members of Truman's cabinet who said, we can't continue to finance feeding Berlin and doing this mission. And he's like, no, we're not going to stop. It's going to continue. We're not shutting this down. But for Stalin, he saw that really he had lost this one. We didn't really run into a fight per se, but it could have. I mean, another war could have erupted. And on May 12th, 1949, they lifted the blockade. They had 277,000 flights. But the Cold War still continued for 4 more decades. But this particular blockade of Berlin and us coming through with the Berlin Airlift to get supplies and aid to the people of Berlin, this was a way that we were able to settle a conflict between us without actually going to war. And it also opened up that relationship between the United States, France, Great Britain, and the German people, because they didn't see us as that conquering enemy anymore who came in and defeated them during the war. They now saw us as people who were trying to save and protect them from the Soviet Union. So the Cold War, it is going to divide the world. The United States and the Soviet Union, our policies will pretty much dictate what we do. And we see that one nation isn't getting involved in a part of the world, and then we're going to go there and try to stop it, and they're going to do the same. So we're both going to set out to try to influence different areas around the world when they start to have conflicts, and we start to take sides, and it's always the opposite side, so that we could try to influence the people to be just like us. And sometimes both sides do some horrible things in order to win in that realm. We do end up creating rival alliances. NATO versus Warsaw Pact. So NATO, you have 10 Western nations that will align with the U.S. and Canada, and that will go against what is in the Warsaw Pact, the Soviet Union, and their satellite nations. Now, these are not nations that were freely joining up with the Soviet Union, but these are the nations in Eastern Europe that they had liberated from Germany, and now they're under the domination of the Soviet Union and have that influence from Moscow. Both of these alliances are military alliances. So they are designed to help each other out militarily if something does happen. For us, ours was created in response to the Berlin blockade. And with the Warsaw Pact, we're going to see that construction of the Berlin Wall. It does take a little bit of time before we get to that Berlin Wall, and they will start to escalate the security around that wall. But with the Berlin, I'm going to venture back here to that map. So you have Berlin here, and we know we have those 4 occupied zones, and we know that the US and France and Great Britain are going to probably unite their zones in Berlin as they had over here in Germany. Well, the Soviet Union will eventually put a wall around that zone because the people can easily go from one side to the other here in Berlin, where you could literally walk in the front door of a building in the Soviet zone of Berlin, go out the back door, and end up in West Berlin, in the free zone, in the democratic zone, in the capitalist zone. And by that time, we're looking at Nikita Khrushchev as the premier of the Soviet Union. So Stalin had passed away in 1953. And for Khrushchev, he wanted the West to do something to prevent the people from going from East Berlin into West Berlin because they were losing workers and they were losing people who they saw could really help out their nation and their sector. And we pretty much said, no, we're not going to stop people from coming into West Berlin. If they want to be here, they can be here. So then one morning, people woke up and the wall was being built, and eventually West and East Berlin will be separated, and we won't see that wall come down again until 1989, 1990. All right, so nuclear war and the space race. So the Soviet Union explodes its first atomic weapon in 1949. So that upper hand that we had at the end of World War I, yeah, that's over. They have access to atomic weapons too. And so now we keep going back and forth. We end up with the hydrogen bomb by 1953, both of us. So now we're looking at brinkmanship. We're on the verge. We're on the brink of a nuclear war. But people will start to back off because they see that both sides could destroy the other. We have the Soviets launch Sputnik, this unmanned satellite into space. And now we feel that, oh my gosh, we are so far behind in technology. We cannot let the Soviets get ahead. So we start to see funding going into technology and science programs, particularly within our schools. And really, we start to launch all of this. Like, we cannot get behind the Soviet Union in 1958. And we continue to escalate that. The US starts to spy. So then we move through some of our presidents. We have Truman, we're in Eisenhower. We start to spy on the Soviet Union, and unfortunately, we got kind of busted on that. The U-2 spy planes, they caught us, and then that led to some tensions between us, and it eliminated some meetings between their leader and our leader. But we found that espionage can be a way for us to gain knowledge about what's going on. And we could use that to our advantage. It doesn't always have to be in your face going to war all the time, but let's use a little espionage and start to get our spy systems going. And then this little political cartoon here takes us to a level where, yeah, we almost do go head to head. So we have Nikita Khrushchev and we have John F. Kennedy. And this will take us, eventually into the Cuban Missile Crisis with planting of weapons. And Cuba's very close, and Cuba's going to fall to communism. They're going to have their own revolution, and Castro is going to take over, and he's going to push the United States out. And eventually, with the embargoes and economic sanctions we place upon Cuba, the Soviet Union will come to Cuba's aid as long as they're willing to accept communism and as long as they are willing to accept the Soviet Union putting weapons and missiles in Cuba directed toward the United States. And at that point is when we almost end up in that head to head clash with the Soviet Union. But Khrushchev will back down and we will win that game, I guess, of chicken. And Khrushchev will end up having to be pulled from his position in the Soviet Union. He failed keeping the people in Berlin and started to have to build a wall. And then they said, well, you blanked against the United States in the Cuban Missile Crisis. So what I'm going to ask you guys to do now, you've gone through the first video of notes and then the second video of notes. I would like for you to decide, based on the notes that were provided, who do you think, which nation do you believe was responsible for the development of the Cold War? So that's the question I would like for you to answer for our last lesson online. Who was responsible for the development of the Cold War? And I'd like for you to give me one or two reasons why you're choosing, maybe it's a country or maybe it's a leader. All right. Have a good day.